This is probably the last section I want to do on Egypt. As I did with evolution, I've spent more time on Egypt than was outlined in this book. For those who are not aware, I'm following a curricula that was designed by Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, by Dr. Josephine Yakinen and Dr. John Henry Clark. They've laid out probably around 3 years worth of class sessions. I spent much more time on evolution than they did in the outline because I felt it was important to understand all of the various aspects of evolution to get a good start, a good basis for this whole course. Likewise, since Egypt is so very, very important, I've spent much more time on Egypt than Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben spent in their outline. We looked at agriculture, metallurgy, all those things that are now taken for granted by us, and things to which most of us give credit to the Greeks or the Romans or somebody else, because we were told that did nothing come out of Africa. We now know that's not the case. Finally, we've talked several times about religion. We've seen now the weighing of the soul of Ani. It's on the walls of the temple of Dendera. A brother over here has seen it. And we know that those symbols tell the basic story that's incorporated into the Christ model. We've passed around calendars of several years past, back 10, 15 years. And we know now that the two most religious holidays, most sacred holidays in Christendom, namely Christmas and Easter, have nothing whatsoever to do with the Christian church. The birth of the Son was something that folks in Kemet knew about 5,000 years ago. And that's a good 3,000 years before the Jesus story. The Easter moves from month to month and day to day because it's, by definition, the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. The spring equinox this year was on March the 20th. I did not check yet to find when the first full moon is, but I know it's not yet. Because when it occurs, the very next Sunday will be Easter. I think it's somewhere around April the 7th or 12th, somewhere in there. Imagine just a little bit of stuff we've learned thus far and how many people have no concept of that whatsoever. Today, what I'm going to do is to take us into another area. We've talked about Christianity in Egypt, but there's a step in between, namely folks we now call Jews. They're the link between Egypt and the Christian world. And in fact, Dr. Finch, in his book, Echoes of the Old Dark Land, has a lot of information relative to that. Now, I asked you to buy this book. I've not had a lot of time as yet to focus on the book because I've had so much other stuff I wanted to show you. But I'm going to begin moving more and more now to the book because there's some very critical chapters in Echoes of the Old Dark Land. I'm going to turn the light back on so I can read. I want to start by talking about mythology. Who is Miss Jane Pittman?
Cicely Tyson.
Good answer. If you ask that question in the average grade school, if the kids know anything about Miss Jane Pittman at all, and unfortunately most of them probably don't know anything about her, never heard her name because none of the rap stars talked about her. Come on, dear. But if they know anything about her at all, they probably think that she's a real person. Totally mythological person. She symbolizes a person who tried to help other people prepare to take black people forward, only to come to recognize at a certain point that it was in fact their job to do that. Miss Jane Pittman trained one man after another to be the one to lead black people forward. She'd ask them, is you the one? One after one, they'd be killed or they'd run away or they'd give up the mission. And finally, at the end of her life, because she had lived her life in such a way that she could train up somebody behind her, she found that she, in preparing them, had prepared herself. So that at the critical, that fantastic scene that Cecily does where she walks to the water fountain, at that point wasn't a white person in that town did not have that drink of water. Because she had more dignity and more soul power than they could ever imagine. I would guess that probably 25, 50 years from now, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X will be mythological characters. Folks already are beginning to make up things about their lives that are not quite true. My oldest son is in town this week. He may come by before the end of the class. Right now he's filling in for me with my grandbabies. He's written a little story about a meeting between Martin and Malcolm. There's a play called The Meeting that talks about a meeting between Martin and Malcolm. According to the records, so far as we know, Martin and Malcolm never had a sit-down conversation. There's a picture of them passing each other in the Atlanta airport. They shook hands as they were changing planes. But so far as we know, they never had a sit-down conversation. But I imagine 25 years from now, it'll be commonly thought by most people that Martin and Malcolm were sitting down planning stuff together. They would have moved into the realm of mythology. I was told that George Washington, well, let me ask you, what did George Washington do? He chopped down a cherry tree.
Threw a silver dollar across the Potomac River.
Threw a silver dollar across the Potomac River. Okay, what else? Never told a lie. All three of those are lies. I saw George Bush's nephew on TV last week, and he was talking about the fact that we had been opposed to the Arab governments running our ports. And he said that was un-American. We need to get back to the way America used to be. Obviously, he believes the myth about America. America's always been prejudiced. You know, every Negro in that watching that TV show should have been able to raise their hand and say, that's a lie. you know, Miles maybe say, you talk about the good old days. I was there. Where was that? So Dr. Finch in this book, Echoes of the Old Dark Land, has some very, very important information. And I want to deal with some of that today as we talk about the religio-linguistic connection between Judaism and Egypt. Yes?
Also to add changing the currency, could that have signaled that activity, signal the changing of the guard? Or like a new...
Oh, yes, that was the new system, yes. Yeah. George Washington and his people replaced those who had actually started out. Yes. Now, Dr. Finch in this book, Echoes of the Old Dark Land, begins where we began in terms of evolution. He moves through the whole concept of the Great Mother and the origin of human culture. Our first symbols, of course, that we understood was the mother being symbolic of life, because we saw life coming from the mother. The old adage, mama's baby, daddy's maybe. So the matriarchy starts out as our major system. What holdover do we currently have in our language from the time when the matriarchy was the power on the planet?
Question is, what holdover?
Yeah, there's a character that we very often see represented on TV. I'll give you a hint. On some of the lottery commercials. That's a holdover from the time when the females ruled.
Fairy godmother?
Not the fairy godmother, another one.
Mother Nature.
Mother Nature. You hot today. Mother Nature.
Doctor next to
That's right. That's it. Mother Nature. See, Mother Nature is a symbolic holdover from the time when females, were the predominant symbol. Then the patriarchy replaced the matriarchy. And that's another chapter in Dr. Finch's book, chapter 3, The Emergence of the Patriarchy, Paradigm of Becoming. I'm going to deal today with chapter 5 rather, Nile Valley sources of the Old Testament. Dr. Finch says this: in our previous chapters, we've attempted to lay a foundation using the Massian method of natural genesis for discussing, that's after Massey, the writer, for discussing the religious themes that came to dominate the history of the Western world. In our approach, we've attempted to show the extent to which myth and religion interpenetrate. 129, sorry. Page 129. In our approach, we've attempted to show the extent to which myth and religion interpenetrate, moving between each other. Myth is, after all, a symbolic or topological means of representing the psyche, cultural, and natural dimensions of reality. All that's saying is that myth is another way of representing that. Through myth, archaic humanity sought to make tangible the impalpable, to create order from chaos, to give form to the inchoate, and to make the cosmos intelligible in terms of the common experience of humanity. So we're talking about people trying to understand the world around them and make some sense out of it. Myth was then, as it is now, the only truth that man could grasp, because in its pristine form, it achieved for him a synthesis of all reality. Today, the dross of myth, the weight of myth, as fables, fairy tales, and superstitions, the marking of the Germans, the marching of the Germans, that's the term the Germans used to talk about those things together, fables, fairy tales, and superstitions, is mistaken for real gold. In other words, today, the mythology has been accepted by people as being the actual truth, when in fact the mythology is pointing to a truth behind itself. A female attorney here in Washington, I can see her face, can't call her name right now, I used to write a column for the Observer, I think it was, here in Washington, and she had a column called The True Truth. It always struck me because the truth is supposed to be true, but she's talking about the true truth. In other words, behind what you've been told, there's something even more true you have not been told. And that's the relation between myth and actual reality. He's almost saying that we really don't even have the ability to approach a complete understanding of reality. So what we do, we reduce it to things we can understand and put those into the form of myth. The debasement of the coinage of myth has led us to equate it with fiction, falsehood, and fantasy. And that's a common misconception in the Western world. If you tell somebody you're talking about a myth, they think you're talking about something that's not true. When in fact, in the African sense, you're talking about something that's truer than truth, deeper than deep, okay? We have steadfastly refused to look beyond the surface structure of myth, seeing only with the empirical eye instead of the intuition to which true myth speaks. Joseph Campbell, he wrote a book called The Power of Myth, has called myths depersonalized dreams and dreams personalized myths. And in this, he is undoubtedly correct. But myths are not merely, epiphenomenal of psychic activity. Its substrates feed directly into the psyche from the concrete external sources organized by the activities, behaviors, and experiences of human beings. Now, when you go back and read this on your own, you got about 4 or 5 vocabulary words up in there. Dr. Finch is an educated man, and he knows his vocabulary. Okay. We can therefore say that there is no religion without myth. In fact, no organized system of thought can escape it. An ostensibly anti-theistic, a-religious doctrine such as Marxism still expresses itself in mythic forms and images, to wit, the sacred symbols of the hammer and sickle, the revealed scriptures of Das Kapital, or the worship of dead sacred kings, Lenin and Stalin, lying in state in Red Square. The withering away of the state is merely the Marxist version of utopia, paradise, or nirvana. Even in an anti-mythic age, mythic impulses inform everything that we do. Take myth out of religion, and there is no religion. Take myth out of religion, and there is no religion. Gerald Massey, in 36 years of mind-bending labor, was able to demonstrate that revealed Judeo-Christian religion, as preserved in the Old and New Testaments, represents but the creation of history out of purely mythical events. Figures and episodes in Scripture, meant to be allegorical expressions of an age-old mystery drama, were gradually transmogrified into real persons and events. The unbelievable and fantastic in the Bible are precisely those elements that were originally mythical, then made historical. Revealed religion is but unrevealed mythology. So we talk about the Exodus as presented in the Bible. That's purely a mythic activity. We talk about Moses on the mountain getting the Ten Commandments in the hand of God. That's a mythic activity. We talk about Moses in the burning bush. That's a mythic activity. All people write mythology. And sometimes people even use mythology to help move them down the road to a greater degree of freedom. The book of Daniel in the Bible talks about the freedom of the Hebrew people. If my history is correct, at a certain time in their history, when they were under pressure, some Jewish writers wrote the book of Daniel. They then buried it. They then discovered it and used that as the basis of their freedom. How? Well, let's say that you and I want to lead black folk forward. We figure all they need now is just one more little push and we could be free. We got the money now. We got the intelligence. We just somehow can't seem to get off the dime. We need a push to get us off the dime. There you go right there, Cobb. What can we do? Let's say we wrote a testament. I'll go back to something I talked about before. Let's say that we found a book that says there was a secret meeting between Martin King and Malcolm X, and that they went and spoke to an old wise grandmother down in Alabama who used to do root work. And they asked her, when will this thing break out? When will our people be free? And let's say she told them, well, both of you are going to die in the struggle, but 45 years after your death, black folk are going to mount up and move forward. What if that book said that? What would that tell us to do? Mount up and move forward. That's the same way the book of Daniel was written. Folks are under pressure. They wrote a book that said very soon, we're going to be free. They buried it, they dug it up, and they read it, and the people said, wow, it's time to come. Okay? So, the power of myth can be used. This country exists because of mythology. Most of the folks in this country would rise up if they ever came to realize that this country is not what it says it is. All of our beliefs are based upon myth. We have myths about the school system. We believe that the school system is actually organized to educate our kids. That's why we send them. Some folks have figured out that that's a myth. Average housewives have figured out, and when I say average housewives, I'm not demeaning housewives. I'm saying they're not quote, professional people in that sense. They're homemakers. Average homemakers have found out that they can teach their kids elementary and junior high school work in a way that's superior to a trained teacher. And they're doing it. And the kids are doing fine. Other folks, are not approaching that because they still believe the myth. Here in Washington, D.C., every year more kids fail than fail the year before. And we have not come to recognize that something's wrong. I read a report this week that said that Howard University, the male population is now sunk to 35%. Women outnumber men 2-to-1. Obviously, something in our educational system for black people is not working. Something in our educational system or social system or both. We're not doing anything about it because we believe the mythology that you've got to be trained to make a difference. That mythology was pushed forward during the O.J. Simpson trial. Every person that came to the stand, they asked them, who are you? Where did you graduate? What have you written? And they were all very proud and happy to give their credentials. There was one lady, one middle-class white lady, who wore 2 watches, one a wind-up watch and one a battery-powered watch, who knew exactly what time the Akita dog had barked. There were only 2 problems with that. The first problem was that she was not credentialed. So far as we know, she was not a college graduate, did not have a PhD, had not written a slew of books. The second problem was, if the dog barked when she said the dog barked, OJ was already at the airport. They discredited her, made her look like a fool. But as I watched that, I recognized that she was the only one that knew exactly what had happened. She was not discounted because she didn't know what happened. She was not discounted because it was believed that only experts could testify. Okay? So we follow myths all the time. In examining the Bible myths, we have no intention of debunking them as mere fictions, but of tracing them back to their original condition. We wish to euphemize them. That is, to chip away the incrustations of a bogus historicity. The brother can write, okay? So they can be understood in their original essence. That accomplished, it will become clear and evident that both testaments are fundamentally Afro-Kemetic at their root. This is not to deny the kernel of historical fact present in most Bible stories. Stay with me now. But these facts are so fused with the myths that it's almost impossible to detangle them. Once the proper keys are applied, however, it's possible to unveil a new biblical revelation, one that explains the source and substance of Judeo-Christian belief. Now, there's the term eponymous. Anybody know what eponymous means? What's an eponymous character? Yes, sir.
The character is represented by something, or that represents.
That's right. Miss Jane Pittman is an eponymous character. She represents that a person who struggled to make us free, did the best they could, train up people to move forward, at some point had to step out there on faith herself. Abraham is an eponymous character. You realize that? We don't know the name of the man who came out of Ur of the Chaldees into Egypt. We don't know if that's where they came from. But that's where the history said they came from. The person has to have a name. The name has been given is Abraham.
Is there any history of his parents?
No. Well, now the Bible tells us his daddy was, but that's eponymous too. Okay. In the genealogy of Jesus, all those begats, that's all eponymous. We know he had a grandfather, as a case, there's a person that had a grandfather, a great-grandfather, have no idea who the person is. Think about that. How many of you can trace your lineage back 7 generations?
How many?
7.
I got 3.
I can trace my grandkids' lineage back about 7 generations to George Henry Black, my great-grandfather. Their great-great-great-grandfather, I think. That's probably the right number of greats. But most of us here in 2006 cannot trace 7 generations. How, without modern means, without modern record keeping, at a time when folks didn't even have last names, how can we trace 12 generations of Jesus' relatives? They're eponymous characters. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the gospel writers, are eponymous characters. Those gospels written by 4 different groups of people in different areas of the Fertile Crescent for their own purposes. Different versions, yes, for different purposes. Mark was the first gospel written. Mark says nothing at all about any lineage or birth of Jesus. Matthew was the second gospel written. It's put first because it has the story of the birth. If I put Matthew after Mark, and you got some sense of the fact that that's the historical order, you then ask some questions. If I put Matthew before Mark, it all flows, and you ask no questions. Okay? Matthew is twice as long as Mark, because Matthew was written by Jewish rabbis who needed enough text to fill the entire liturgical year. Mark only filled half of the liturgy. They needed double the amount of readings to fill out the entire year, so they expanded them. Yes, let's hand up here.
I noticed in reading Matthew, Mark.
No, the right one, yes.
In reading Matthew, Mark, there some verses are repeated.
Yes.
In a couple of them, I forgot which. But
Many of them are repeated because Matthew is nothing but an expansion of Mark. And even with it being an expansion of Mark, there's still differences because some information didn't get passed down right. I mean, I've got a book this thick of errors in the Bible. They're not errors per se, they're disagreements. The one book disagrees with the other one. You know, Luke was the first gospel written by a community of non-Hebrews. Now, in Matthew, when the lineage of Jesus is traced, being written by Hebrew rabbis, they found it sufficient to begin their lineage with Abraham. Abraham, the father of the Jewish people. Luke, being a book written by non-Hebrews who had converted to that form of Judaism, starting with Abraham would not include them. So they start the lineage with Adam. The little quirks here and there. If you know these things, they help to make the text come alive more because you can trace how things are developed. John was written after the fall of the temple, the grand temple of Israel in Jerusalem, in 70 CE, 70 the Common Era. We know that because John no longer speaks about Jewish worship in the same way it had been spoken of before. John does not picture the temple ever being rebuilt, the center of worship. So he now makes Jesus the center of worship. We don't have a temple in Jerusalem anymore, but now we got Jesus. Wherever we go, we can carry Jesus with us. Okay? You'll see right there, my dear, for you. So these are some of the things that you get by having people that give you a historical development of the Bible. Now, most of your top Bible scholars know this. Reverend Jones don't know this. Reverend Jones doesn't know this, number one, because if Reverend Jones is a called preacher, it means that Reverend Jones has never had any formal education.
That's right.
He went to a church, he followed the main minister, became an assistant minister, did chores for the minister, learned to memorize scriptures and whatnot. At a certain point, passed the trial sermon in front of other ministers, had the right hand of fellowship laid on him, got his license, he preaching. Now, category 2, Reverend Jones, who now calls himself Reverend Dr. Jones, he went to the Howard University School of Theology. Okay? Now, he also has not had much education. He got an undergraduate degree in liberal arts, went to School of Divinity, where he studied hermeneutics and homiletics and preaching, all those subjects, how to manage a church. No comparative religion. No history of Judaism whatsoever. If you named the high Jewish holy day, he wouldn't even know what it meant. He now calls himself Reverend Dr. Jones, because you've been to college. Then the divinity level degree is a master's degree. But the congregation don't know that. And besides, everybody else is a doctor. He can't be less than a doctor. He got a choice. He can be a doctor. He can be a bishop. He can be an overseer. Okay, he got to have some kind of title. Okay, can't just be Reverend Jones. Okay, all right. Now, the third category of ministers do have an earned PhD degree in theology. That's the LLD, I guess. They are the very ones now who are at the center of debunking the Christ myth. Kozan and other folks who write these books about Jesus. He's saying, that's mythology. That didn't happen that way. This is all symbolic. There's something behind the symbol, but it's not. Don't just take the symbol on face value. Let me stop for a second with that. What was the symbol? If we understand that the whole thing about Jesus is mythology, what's the message? Yes, ma'am. Because we missed the message because of the myth.
The message is, can you hear me? The message is to, it sets up a moral code of treating your fellow man.
Who is Jesus?
Who is he? He's
Yeah.
supposed to be the Son of God.
You are.
I am, I am.
That's the answer. You are.
Yes.
Now, 99% of the folks going to church tomorrow will not realize that they're Jesus.
Praise to God.
The story of Jesus is a story of personal development. How you develop yourself in what's called the old mystery system, how you develop yourself to take on your moral duty to love God and do right to your fellow man, to give sight to the blind and hearing to the deaf, to help the lame walk. Brother Carver. Come on now.
But I dare any one of us to go to church tomorrow and say that. They'll beat us.
That's right.
In the name of God.
In the name of God, that's right. No, they beat you in the name of Jesus. Now imagine, just imagine this coming Easter, if 10% of the Christians recognize that they are being resurrected that day. That that's the day for their spirit to come alive. See, they fall for the myth, but they miss the message. That's what's being talked about when he talks about the message behind the myth. The whole purpose in Kemet of even creating a Jesus mythology was to show you the steps you're supposed to go through to become a son of God. One of those critical steps was the whole thing in the wilderness. That's not an actual activity. Jesus and the devil weren't talking together. But what's the myth say? Well, it says that Satan says to Jesus, I know you're hungry and you're tired. If you be the Son of God, why don't you turn these rocks into bread? Eat. Jesus says, no, man does not live by bread alone. In other words, I'm not going to accept your definition of who I am and move by your rules.